learn something new. And yeah, thank you. All right, Pastor Wayne, I read the passage already. So.
Good? Oh man, you guys are fast. I didn't realize I was dropping off my kids and I didn't realize it. All right, so good morning, everyone. Good to be with you as we have our last and final sermon series on our last of our vision statement, right? So we've been sharing this the past couple of weeks. This is our fourth week in our vision statement, and this is something that strategic planning team has been, kind of working hard on for the past year or so to really figure out what direction our church really should be heading in. And so, we started off talking about making disciples. Then we spent 3 sermons, right? This is the last one on love God, build one another up, and serve our community. And hopefully, I think we were thinking maybe we should have like a little quiz during retreat next week to see how many people have this memorized. But we hope that you can at least have the short version of this memorized. So I click over the next slide, which is you see it right there, right? To make disciples who love God, build one another up, and serve our community. And so hopefully everyone can have that portion of it memorized. But as I've been saying the past couple of weeks, we really want also all of us to be able to know how to apply it. Right, so we have this vision statement, but how do we actually apply it into the life of our church? And so this is the slightly longer version, which, maybe you can have memorized as well. My clicker is not working, so you might have to click for me. But the longer version is this, right? To make this. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to bring this into action, right? So we're going to make disciples who love God through practicing corporate worship, what we're doing right now, prayer and Bible reading. Secondly, we're going to build one another up, and this is specifically through committing to covenant groups and being in discipleship relationships. We should probably also add fellowship groups, right, like Joy, Living Water, Kids Min, stuff like that. And then finally, this week, we're talking about serve, right? We're going to serve our community. And mainly, when we talk about serving our community, we mean that in 3 different ways, right? So our church community, our local community, and our global community, right? So that's basically what the sermon is about, right? What does that look like? What does it look like for our church to serve in these 3 different contexts, right? Our church community, our local community, and also our global community. Now, before I jump into specifics of each of these, right? So we're going to go through each of those 3, but before I do that, I want to talk a little bit more generally about why we serve, right? Why is it that we have serve as part of our vision statement, right? Why is this so important to us as a church? And so I want to make just 3 quick points about why we serve, right? Why do we serve? And so first point is this, right? So first, we are to see ourselves as servants because Jesus shows us this better way of life, right? So the argument I'm trying to make is that serving, right? If we take on this attitude of a servant, right? Not only is it good for God in the sense that we are glorifying God. Not only is it good for other people, right, because we're serving other people, but I want to make the argument that it's also good for us. That to live a meaningful and joyful and purpose-filled life, right, you can't live it by only thinking about yourself. You can't do it by serving yourself. The only way you live a joyful, meaningful, purposeful life, right, is actually if we take on this attitude of being a servant, just as Jesus did. Right. So if you look at this, it says. In Matthew 20, it says, "But Jesus called them and said to him, and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So if you think about it, right, when Jesus came onto the earth, right, Jesus, comes onto the earth, and what Jesus does is that he actually shows us the way that God intended human beings to live, right? So when Jesus came to earth, right, he became a human, and God is showing us right? The intent of what a human being, the way that a human being is supposed to live, the way that we were created to live. And assuming that God is good, right? Assuming that God knows best, right? That he would know what is the best way for us to live, assuming that he has created us. And what Jesus does is that he shows us, right? What does it actually look like, right? To live in the way that God intended. And so Jesus says the way that you do that, right, is to live your life in service to others. Right? And as you do that, you're going to glorify God who created us. It's going to be good for the people around you, but it's also going to be joyful and meaningful for you as well. Right? And so if you think about, so I've been thinking about Hebrews 12, right? And then this comes to mind, pretty often as I think about this, because it says in Hebrews 12:2, it says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, right, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And I keep thinking about that word joy, right, because Jesus lived his life as a servant, right, completely to serve us, right? That's what it just said in Matthew. And how can Jesus even have any sense of joy, right, as he is going to the cross, right? As he looks at the cross, as he's enduring the cross, how can there be any sense in which he is experiencing joy? But I think we kind of understand that, right? That's the reason is that if you live a life that is for others, a life that is sacrificed for others, it is meaningful, right? I mean, sometimes we experience that in really small ways, right? It feels good to help other people. It feels good to teach someone something, right, that you may be good at. It feels good to talk to a stranger, right? Even though you got to get over the initial anxiety, but it feels good to talk to a stranger. It feels good to give gifts, right, to other people, right? There's a sense in which when we serve other people, right, it actually brings meaning and joy into our lives, right? And then the reason why Jesus can have this sense of joy, right, because he's known that his sacrifice and his death on the cross is meaningful, it's purposeful, it has an intention, right? It's a people that he is loving, it's us that he is loving as he's enduring the cross, and he senses that joy, right, even on the cross, right, for the joy set before him, that he's able to endure it, right? And I think we all kind of, maybe feel this, that, a life lived for others, right? A life that is sacrificed for others is very meaningful in that way, right? And a life that is lived for yourself, a selfish life, is often also a very miserable life, as well. Sometimes maybe you sense this as, maybe I'm on Reddit too much, but like as you sense this, like as people age, right? There's really just grumpy old people that it's just like don't have people around them, and then like they're, and so sometimes I feel like I'm on my path there too, because I'm like, really grumpy all the time, like, these youths these days, or this and this, and like always complaining about stuff. But there's a sense, right, in which is like you can get there, right? You can get there to a point where you're kind of by yourself because on Reddit there's all these stories about how people messed up their whole lives and like they're estranged from their family, and it's like really sad reading it. But it's like you can sense that, right? Like that can happen, right, as people live their lives, and a life that is, as you continue to make decisions, just, kind of selfish decisions, where you end up on your own, right? And so there's a sense in which you sense that, the life that is meaningful, a life that is purposeful, a life that actually glorifies God, a life that is actually good for me, right? It's actually a life that is lived in service to other people, right? And so, so that's the first point, right? So why should we be a servant to all? Why do we have this mentality of serving, right? It's because Jesus shows us, right, that this is the meaningful way to live, glorifies God, good for the people around us, and also for our joy. Right, so that's the first point. Secondly, so why do we serve, right? Why do we take on this attitude of servant? So the second point is this. The second point is serving God is not so that we can earn his favor. Serving God, we serve because God has called us to play a part in accomplishing his purposes. All right, so why do we serve, right? So serving is not to earn God's favor, but rather we serve because God has called us to play a part, right, in accomplishing his purposes. Right, so as we're doing church things or community things or missions things, right, it's really important that we never think of it as a means of earning God's favor. Right, we should never think of it as, hey, God, look at all that I'm doing for you, right? Therefore, you owe me one. Right? Or look at how good I'm living my life, right? Therefore, you owe me an answer to a prayer, right, later on. Right? We must never think that that as we're trying to serve God, that it's to earn his favor in any way, right? We don't serve God to increase our standing before Him, right? Because the gospel tells us, right? What does the gospel tell us? It tells us that we are already beloved children of God, right? There's nothing that we can do to make God love us more, right? There's nothing we can do to make God love us less, right? And so therefore, why do we serve, right? Because we serve because God has called us, right, to play a part in accomplishing His purposes. And really, when you become a Christian, right, your life kind of changes in a lot of different ways, right? No longer do you just think, oh, this is what I want for my life, right? This is the plan that I have for my life, right? Then no longer do you just think, oh, this is where I want my life to go, right? No longer do you think, oh, this is what I want my life to look like. Right? Rather, as we become a Christian, right, rather it becomes, God, what do you want for my life? Right, God, where do you want me to go? Right, God, what do you want my life to look like? Right, and what God is doing, that as we, there's a whole transformation when we come to know Christ, right? That it's not just our salvation, right? But it's our whole lives is what does it look like for God to be glorified? And God, out of His grace, right, gives us a good work to do, gives us a plan for our lives, right, that becomes really meaningful, really purposeful, right, because what we are doing, right, our new goal in life, right, is to do the things that God has called us to do. And I like to think about this in terms of prayer, right, so if you think of prayer, so one of the ways in which God accomplishes His will on earth, right? So God is in control of history. He's accomplishing His will on earth. And I think one of the ways actually that God accomplishes His will on earth, right, is when He causes people to pray. Right, so the normative way, right, I'll argue that the normative way that God accomplishes His purposes on earth is that He stirs up in someone's heart something to pray, and then God answers that prayer, right? And so for example, right, so you have, if you think about Nehemiah, right, God wanted the Israelites to come back from exile, right, and go back to Jerusalem and to worship Him in Jerusalem, right? That's God's will. Well, what does He do? He raises up Nehemiah, right? And Nehemiah hears a report that the walls of Jerusalem are, all torn down. And so Nehemiah prays, right, and says, God, and you put this on my heart, I would like to go restore the walls back in Jerusalem, and then God answers his prayer, right? The normative way that God accomplishes His will on earth is when He stirs up someone to pray and He answers that prayer, right? Or, for example, you have this in James, right? It says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, which means that he was not anyone special. Yes, he was a prophet, but he's just like us, right? Sinful human being. And he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore fruits, right? God, what we see is that God is working through Elijah, right? So I'm not going to get into all the details, but, there was the drought that God wanted to bring, and then there was rain to just kind of show the Israelites, who He is. And how does He accomplish that? Well, He has Elijah pray. Right, He could have just done it, right? God could have just done it. If He wants to stop the rain, right, He's going to do it anyways. But He has, no, I'm going to have Elijah pray, and I'm going to answer his prayer, right? And so the normative way, right, that God works, that accomplishes His will on earth is by stirring up in people's hearts to pray, and He answers those prayers, right? That's how God engages us in the work that He's doing around the world. Right, so to give you just 2 quick examples. So I read this in a book. The book's called Touch the World Through Prayer. And in that book, there's a story that goes that, so God put, so the whole premise of the book, right, is that you, right here in Philadelphia, when we pray, that we can actually change the world or affect the world, right? Touch the world through prayer. And there's a story in there where God this is a couple hundred years ago, and in England, right, the missionaries that are just arriving in China, if you know the whole history, there were missionaries in China really, really early on, and then, that kind of got shut down. But then later on, right, there was a bunch of missionary activity, bringing the gospel to China. And there was a man living in England, and he, felt that burden to pray for China. And so what he did is that he, grabbed a map, and, he would journal about this, that he would just pray for different cities, right? So he'll pray for, different cities in China and that they would be open to hearing the gospel. And after he died, right, there was a whole list of 20 cities that he found, that was found in his journal of the cities that he devoted, his time and life praying for. And actually later on, only after it died, it was discovered that every city that he prayed for, right, there was a surge of new believers in that area, right, in that specific place. And I think the book actually says it was specifically in the order that he prayed for them, right? In the order that he prayed for the cities, there was a surge of new believers in those places. Now you can see, you can just be like, well, it's just a coincidence, right? Just happened to be that way. But I think that, I do think that it's a biblical principle, right? How does God accomplish his purposes on earth? Well, he causes his people to pray, right? So maybe one more example. So in college, I was the prayer chair or something. I forget what it was called. But basically, I was responsible for organizing the prayer meetings for our college fellowship for a semester. And so, we just meet, and then people will come, and then we'll just, have prayer requests, and we'll pray. And so one year, God, said, hey, what if you gave me this idea of what if we pray for the whole roster of people, right? So like we do these sign-up fairs in the beginning of every college semester, right? We do this big sign-up fair, and then everyone just writes down their name, and an email and whatnot, and then we invite them to fellowship. And so we had this whole list of people that came by our activities booth and put their name down and said, hey, let's just pray for that, right? And so we just started praying through all the names. Every week we'll take a couple names and we'll just pray through it. And so this one time we prayed for someone. Again, I have no idea who he is, right? Just some random person that signed up on our activity sheets. And I found out later, right, that actually the very same week that we prayed for this person, right, it was the first week that he decided to come out to one of our Bible studies. And again, you could say, it's just a coincidence, right? Just how many you could calculate the probability maybe of what if that can happen. But I think as we begin to pray, right, we start these coincidences kind of start adding up into what is that God doing through us, right? And so the idea here is that when we serve, right, why do we serve God, right? What's the purpose of serving? Why would we devote our lives to serving God? Well, God in His grace, right, it tells us that the main way, the normative way in which God does His will on earth, right, is to incorporate us, whether it's through prayer or whether it's through our action, whether for us to go and even you can even say that when you think about God promises that He's going to comfort us, right, comfort us in times of sorrow. I would argue that yes, He does that when we are maybe by ourselves in our room and we're praying to Him, and God can bring us comfort. But I also argue that God brings us comfort when the church shows up around us and cares for us, right? God is comforting us through the actions of other people. God is answering our prayers through the actions of other people, right? And so basically the idea here, right, is that the normative way in which God accomplishes His will on earth, right, is to call us, right, to accomplish, to play a part in accomplishing His purposes in the world. All right, so that's kind of number two, right? So we don't do it to earn God's favor, right? It's not because we want Him to for a favor down the line or to increase our standing before God, but really we get to participate in accomplishing His purposes in the world. Now, finally, we serve God by serving people. So, I think about this verse, once in a while as well. So it says in 1 John 4, it says, "We love because He first loved us. If anyone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother." Now, brother here doesn't necessarily mean your actual, blood relative, but really anybody, right? Or just anyone in the church at least, right? Or, brothers and sisters in Christ. And if you're thinking in yourself, okay, what does it look like to serve God, right? I want to serve God. What does that look like? Well, a really practical application of serving God is to serve people, right? Is to love the people around you. And actually, I think sometimes when we, serve, it's actually kind of easy to forget that we are actually that it's all about the people. Right? Sometimes when we serve, even when I'm preaching my sermons, right? Sometimes I get too caught up with the little details of my sermon or the technical aspects of whatever, and I sometimes need to just remind myself, right? I'm not trying to preach to the whole world, right? I'm not trying to preach to every single person. I'm preaching to a very specific 100 people, right? A very specific 100 people that I know, right? So it's like sometimes you just like, sometimes when you prepare a Bible study, or sometimes when you prepare, you focus a lot on your programming, right? You focus a lot on, logistics, and all of that's really important. But sometimes we forget in our serving that it's actually about the people, right? That the whole reason why we serve is because people matter, right? Because loving people actually matters, right? And so for example, we read this in 1 Corinthians 13. Right? It says, "If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or clang cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries, all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but have not love, then I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, deliver up my body to be burned, but have not loved, I gain nothing." Right, what Paul is trying to say here is that you can do all the ministry, right? All the great ministry. You can be the most productive, efficient, best Bible study leader that you can be, right? But if you do not actually love the people, right, that you are serving, love the people that are around you, right? Then Paul says you are nothing, right? It's all about the people. And so, it's not that we shouldn't focus on the, programming or event planning, right? But in the midst of our serving, we have to remember, right, that it's really about doing good and loving the people that are around us, right? So I think these are just the important things to keep in mind before we jump into those, 3 areas of our serving, right? Just to keep in mind that, that why do we serve, right? Why do we even talk about serving? Well, first, right, we see ourselves as servants because Jesus shows us this better way of life. Secondly, serving God is not so we can earn His favor, but we serve because God has called us to play a part and accomplish His purpose. And third, as we serve, we have to remember, right, that it's all about people, right? It's all about our love for people. So, with that, let's take a look at our vision statement, and we're on this third one about serving, of course, and I want to just touch briefly on each of these, right? Serving our church community, serving our local community, and serving our global community, all right? So just want to walk through each one of these and just kind of, give a little, debrief or kind of explanation on what we mean by each of these. I know this is like a 6-point sermon, but don't worry, I'll get you guys out on time. I think I've done this before a couple times. And so, all right, so let's walk through each of these, right? So serving our church community. So I'm actually not going to talk about this one too much, only just because I don't want us to get too insular, right? I don't want us to get too focused on just serving in church, right? Because I actually, hopefully, and part of my plan is that to streamline the things that we do here at church, or even to get rid of some things that we do here at church, which may be kind of crazy. But the reason why I want to do that is because I want to free up people to have more time to actually reach our community, to reach Chinatown, right, to engage in global missions, right? Sometimes I feel like there's so much service is done at church, right, that we forget that we're called to be sent into the world. So I don't want to talk about this, too much, although I will give some areas that it would be great if we have, some help in. But a lot of this is also, the reason why I'm not going to say too much is also last week, this was kind of my point as well. So if you remember last week, right, I talked about how everyone has a mission. Right? Everyone is called by God everyone has a ministry, right? Everyone is called by God to do some kind of ministry. And simply what I mean by ministry is that God has called us to do something, or God has called us to go somewhere, or God has called us to love some people. And, in the end, if you remember, I talked about, even though you may not feel like you have a lot of gifts, right? Sometimes you're like, use your gift to serve one another, and you might not be able to think about what that is. And my point is that you don't need to have an official title here at church in order to serve one another, right? Serving one another can be just reaching out to someone, right, who's in need of encouragement, right? It can be cooking for Living Water or for Joy, right? It can be giving rides to college students. It can be, baking for people. It can be inviting someone over to your home, right? There's a lot of good ways that we can do love, right? Love one another and serve one another, right? So the idea here is that, right, you don't have to have an official title in order to serve our community, right? There's a lot of different ways in which you can do it. So if you want me to, just specifically say what are some areas in our church that maybe could use some help, or some of the more pressing needs that we have, as I just want to put it out there, right, that some of the more pressing needs that we have is currently in AV, right? be great if we get one or two more people that are willing to learn what goes on up there and be able to serve in that capacity. Secondly, we're looking for one or two more joy counselors, to spend some time with our youth. I think it would be really helpful. Third, we're looking for one or two more living water counselors, right, to spend time with our college students. And then finally, the last thing I would just bring up to highlight is that we're potentially looking to rebuild our hospitality team, right? As you know, that we've just kind of been patching that together with different groups taking, different, weeks. But it'd be great if we have like a stable hospitality team to really, care for our church on Sundays, right? So, those are the kind of like the specific areas in which it would be, great for us to be able to have, a couple more people serve some of the more higher priority needs that we have. But I also want to mention here that, one of the things that our strategic plan team spent a good amount of time talking about is that our church, so this came out during our self-study. That was like over a year ago, right? Over a year ago, we're doing this whole self-study where a lot of you guys were interviewed. And one of the big things that came up, right, is that our church has this tendency to burn people out, right? And so that was like the big thing that we needed to address, right? That we kind of had this burnout culture where people would serve and they get burned out and they have to take, years of break. It was just like a really bad, culture that we had here at church. And so that's one of the things that the strategic plan team spent a lot of time talking about. And so I just want to put out there just some of the things that we are setting as like kind of new guidelines to serving. All right, so there are actually, three main things that the strategic plan team talk about, right? So first, so this is all serving, right? Anytime you serve in any capacity, the first thing is that serving is always on a 1-year commitment, right? So no matter what position you hold, I guess unless you're Harry and I, but no matter whatever position you hold, it's a 1-year commitment, right? So every single year, no matter what position it is, we'll ask you, hey, do you want to do it for the next coming year, right? And you have the choice to say no or yes, right? So that's the first thing, right? Every time you serve, it's always a 1-year commitment, right? We'll ask you every year, hey, do you want to continue for the next year? The second thing that we talked about is that there's going to be an ESMT. So ESMT is kind of like the leadership board over ESM. And ESMT, every single ESMT member has been assigned to a particular ministry, right? So basically, whatever ministry you serve in, there is an ESMT member who is supposed to look after you and make sure you're doing okay. And the whole idea of that is that hopefully to provide everyone with more support, so that if you're serving, that hopefully you don't feel like you are alone when you serve, right? That there's going to at least be one person who's in charge of kind of checking in on you, seeing how you're doing, do you need any support, what can we do to help? And then the other aspect of this is to hopefully help with continuity, right? So that whenever you step down, that hopefully we are ready to train up the next person, right? If and when you step down, right? So this is the second thing that we did, right? So every single ministry has a ESMT point person, and hopefully this will increase support and decrease the amount of just aloneness sometimes that you feel, right, in serving here. And then third thing, the third thing I just want to put out there is that I want to put out this thing that you can just try out a ministry, right? Sometimes when you're like, I don't know if I want to commit to that ministry full time, that seems like a lot of work or it seems like a lot of commitment, right? You can definitely just try it out, right? So you can just tell the leader, hey, I'm here just to try things out, and you can serve for a couple months, and if it's for you, right, then we'll go back to the 1-year commitment. If it's not for you, then you can just say, no, I don't think I could do this, and that's perfectly fine as well. And so the intention here, right, is to reduce the amount of burnout, right, that we've experienced, and many of us have experienced here in church, and try to increase the amount of supports. And hopefully, serving becomes a joy, right, because it really should be, right? Serving should really be a joy as we do that and not a burden, right? So I just want to put that out there in terms of like, this is what we are doing as a church to really address this issue of what does it look like to serve in our church community. All right, so that's the first one, right? Serving in our church community. The second one is serving in our local community. And here we specifically mean Chinatown. And I think we're debating if we should just say Chinatown or to leave it a little bit more broad. But I think we decided to leave it more broad because to open up the possibility that we want to maybe be intentional about serving here in Callow Hill, right? We're in the Callow Hill neighborhood, or maybe we're serving in things that affect Philadelphia as a whole. But the main focus of our local serving should be Chinatown. And to be honest, I am still trying to figure out how to engage our entire congregation, right, in service of Chinatown, to be able to serve Chinatown in some way. the things that I'm trying to be involved in, I know that not everyone can do, right? Not everyone can, be involved with the Sons or want to work with youth, and, not everyone can send their kids to a Chinatown daycare, and things like that, right? And so I'm still trying to figure out, right, what does it look like to have our entire congregation to be able to be engaged in loving Chinatown in some way. But I just want to point out, 3 things. So, we're trying to figure this out, but there's at least 3 things on the calendar that I think, would be great as a first step in loving our Chinatown community. So the first thing I want to highlight is that on Halloween, we're going to have a Halloween outreach. And so basically, on Halloween, I think it's a Thursday, I want to say, and we're just going to set up a table outside of our church, and we're probably going to have some candy and have some, simple crafts to do. And then, as kids walk by, we'll just give them candy and, engage them with the crafts. And this is a, really easy way to connect with the community and start to see the people, see the faces that we often see in Chinatown. The second thing just want to put on your calendar is that there's, we don't know the specific date yet, but there's a potential flu clinic that's coming up in November. And depending on how many people we have, we did this really cool thing this one year. We only did this once, but all the pastors split up into 3 groups, right? So the 8 of us split up into 3 groups, and we each took a different street. So, we took, I think me and Peter took 9th Street, and then someone else took 10th Street, and someone else took 11th Street. And basically what we did is that we walked into every single business along the street, and we just went into the door and say, "Hi, does anyone working here want to have a free flu shot?" Because down at church, we're having a free flu shot. And basically that's what we did. We spent the afternoon doing that. And that was actually really cool. That was really fun. I walked into businesses that I didn't even know existed in Chinatown, even though I walk by every single day. And so depending on how many people we have, that'd be kind of a cool thing, a fun thing to be able to, just walk in and just get to know Chinatown a little bit more, by offering this kind of service to them. And then finally, the third thing I just want to point out here is that during Chinese New Year, which I know is still a couple months away, but during Chinese New Year, we have, for the past, it's been a while now, I think 5, 6, 7 years now, we've been serving food to all the Lion Dance volunteers. And actually, in the past couple of years, it's been great to see more people being involved in that service. But that's also just a great way to meet the community, right? Basically, once all the Lion Dance people are done, they come into our other church building, and then in the basement, we have food and a meal for them. And I think last year, the past 2 years, I think we had a lot of baked goods also on that. And that's just a really good way to be able to support the community and get to know the community a little bit more. All right, so again, I'm trying to think of ways that our entire church can engage in loving Chinatown, but those are 3 simple ways I think that we can do it. Now, if you're thinking about doing something with a little bit more intensity or a little bit more commitment, I do want to bring up that we have what is called the Center Ministry Team. Right, so the Center Ministry Team, or CMT for short, is basically the team that supports Harry, right, in all that he does in the center. So basically, I have ESMT, right, so English Speaking Ministry Team. CSM has CSMT, MSM has MSMT, and NE has NEMT. That's a Northeast Church Plant. I know, it's a lot of acronyms. But basically, there's the team that supports that particular ministry, right? And so for Center, we have what's called the CMT. And currently, I think we have 5 people on the team, plus me and Harry. And I think it would be great if we build that team out a little bit more as well. And basically, what we do is we meet once a month, and we talk about Center needs. And then, a lot of people in CMT are pretty involved in, either after school program or sometimes Pump or sometimes, the different things that the center, that goes into center programming. So it would be great, to build up that team a little bit more if you're looking for something with a little bit more commitment in order to serve our community. All right, so in the coming years, this is constantly on my mind, I think, and I really need your help as well, right? What does it look like? How can we really reach Chinatown and be a blessing to Chinatown, right? Because, I'm thinking about this as well, right? This is not like trying to be boastful or prideful or anything, but it's just, for better or for worse, right? We are probably the best church positioned to reach Chinatown. Right, there's like 3 other churches, including us in this local area. But in many ways, I feel like we are the most equipped or ready church to be able to reach Chinatown. And in many ways, I think if we don't do it, then nobody's going to do it. Right? Who's going to reach Chinatown with the gospel? In many ways, I think if we don't try to do that, right? Engage in some of that, right? Then there may not be anyone else who, will do that kind of work. Right, so that's the second thing, right? Our local community. And finally, I just want to talk briefly about global community, right? And this simply is talking about missions. And so I mentioned this before, but there's a slight difference between missions and evangelism, right? So evangelism is simply just sharing the gospel, right? That's evangelism, right? You share the gospel. And what missions is a little bit different, right? Missions is sharing the gospel by crossing a cultural boundary, or sharing the gospel with someone outside of your culture. Right, so that's what missions is, right? Evangelism is just sharing the gospel. Missions is sharing someone outside your culture. And so I think I've said this before too, but if you imagine, right, every single Christian in the whole world shared the gospel with every single person that they knew, right? This includes your coworkers, your Facebook friends, your Instagram friends. This is your random stranger that you pass on the. If you share the gospel with every single person you meet, right? And every single Christian in the world did that, right? And imagine for me that the Holy Spirit did amazing work, and every single person you talk to, right? You just had to say, "Hey, Jesus loves you," and you're like, "Oh, I believe," right? So imagine every single Christian in the world did that, right? And then everyone came to know and love Jesus. And the thing is that if that were to happen, there would still be millions of people in the world that would not know Christ. Right? And the reason for that is because there's millions of people in the world that don't have access to a single person in their entire lives that know who Jesus is. Right? And the idea here of missions is that that if Jesus' disciples only did evangelism, right, the gospel may have never left Israel, right? It probably would just stay there. But as you look out through the New Testament period, what they did was missions, right? They brought the gospel to the nations, right? And this is, of course, the Great Commission, right? The Great Commission is not just go therefore and make disciples, right? Go therefore and make disciples is a good mission, but it says go therefore and make disciples of all nations, right? To bring the gospel to those who have not heard. And so my belief, right, so we always say the Great Commission is for every single Christian, right? Every single Christian, this is your Great Commission. So if this is our Great Commission, then I think every single person that as we follow Jesus, that we have a responsibility, right, to bring the gospel to the nations. And I've said, and so there's different ways, right? I think it generally falls into two categories, right? Either sending or going. And, I've keep saying this, but I always hold out hope that maybe God is calling one of you to go, right? That maybe one of you will be, missionaries, that God is calling you to go to somewhere where they have not heard the gospel, and that you would go and preach to them. But of course, for many of us, I think God calls us to send, right? Many of us, God maybe doesn't call us to go, but maybe call us to send. And I think this is a responsibility for all of us. Now, of course, sending includes prayer, right? I think praying for missionaries. We have a board out there where you have all of the missionaries that we support as a church, right? Praying for them, as I mentioned before, right? With the guy in England praying, right? That, one of the ways that we send is by praying. But of course, the other way that we send is through financial support as well. I just want to, when it comes to giving, the way that Amy and I kind of think about this is that we have three categories when it comes to giving. And by the way, this is on top of tithing, right? So it's 10%, so it's 10% to the church, and what we try to do is we try to do at least 5% to missionaries, on top of that. And we have three categories of missionaries that we support, right? So the first category is probably the most common, which is people who are got called to full-time ministry, and usually they're in the States, right? So that's usually Cru or InterVarsity, right? People are called to serve God full-time in the States, and we support them. The second category that we have is those that are going to quote-unquote reached countries. And reached is kind of this missionary term that basically means that the country, it doesn't mean that every single person in the country is saved. It just means it's reached because most people in that country has access to the gospel, right? So America is considered a reached country, not because everyone's Christian, right? But it's because most people in America have access to the gospel. So for example, we support missionaries that are in the Philippines. Right, the Philippines are considered a reached nation, right, because most of the people there have access to the gospel in some way. Right now, of course, there's nothing wrong with supporting people that are doing missions here in the States or in Philippines or in these reached countries. Right, people need to hear Jesus, know about Jesus in the States. People need to know about Jesus in the Philippines. Right, but Amy and I have this third category that's of special importance to us, and that is people that are called to go where Christ has never been proclaimed before, right? And we are always looking for people, right? Like if we find anybody that is going to somewhere where Christ has never been proclaimed, we have, it is our responsibility to support you, our responsibility to make sure that you have what you need in order for you to go, right? Because I think this is part of our responsibility as Christians, right? To make disciples of all nations, right? Supporting those, especially those that are going to places where Jesus has not been proclaimed. And that last category is actually really hard. It's actually really hard to find missionaries that are doing that kind of work. But actually, if you are, if you want to be intentional about supporting some of these missionaries, you can talk to me later on or send me an email. I could probably connect you with some of these people that are going to unreached people groups. Right, so that's basically, the three things that we have, right? We have our church community, our local community in Chinatown, and our global community. Well, being the first Sunday of the month, we have communion. And you might be thinking, okay, so what does communion have anything to do with community? Right? What is communion, this sacrament that we do once a month? What does this have to do with serving our communities? And the way I want to segue into this is to help you. Many of you know that the early church, when they were just getting started, the church was divided during communion. Right? During communion time, the church was completely segregated. And at that point, it was segregated not by race, but it was segregated by the rich people and the poor people. And basically what was happening is that all the rich people during communion time, they would have bread and eat, and they would be drinking. And it actually says that some of them were getting drunk on wine. Imagine getting drunk on communion wine. That's kind of crazy. But that's what was happening. And then there were another group of people that were poor and didn't have anything, and they were actually going hungry. They actually didn't get anything to eat as well. And so during communion time, right, the church was actually being segregated into those who were rich and wealthy and those who were not. And Paul actually talks about this in 1 Corinthians 11. So he says, "For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk." What? I love that word. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. All right, so Paul, very harsh, rightfully so. Right? You can't have communion time being that. And his whole point is that communion time is actually a reminder for us that God has given us this new community, that God has given us this new family that Jesus has formed. That as we celebrate communion, as we're going to do right now, right, it's actually a reminder for us, right, that this meal is meant to unite us as a church. Right? It's supposed to bring us together. It reminds us that every single one of us comes before the Lord the same way. Right? It doesn't matter your race, your gender, your job, your reputation, your wealth, how many good things you've done, how many bad things you've done. Right? As we come before this table, we're all the same. We are sinners in need of grace. Right? And so as we serve our community here at church, right, as we go out into Chinatown, as we engage in our global missions, in many ways what we're doing is we're inviting people into this new family, this new community, right, that God has created through Jesus Christ. And in many ways, this communion time is not just about you, right, and your personal relationship with the Lord. I know a lot of us, usually treat it that way, which is, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But communion time is not just about us, right, and having our relationship with the Lord, right. But communion is actually about community as well, right. If you think about it, when Jesus had the Last Supper, right, he didn't pull each disciple aside and say, "Hey, let me have communion with you. Let me have communion with you." Right? He did it all together as one group. He says, "We together." Right, are part of the body of Christ. And so as we come before the Lord, I want to encourage you to kind of do two things that are maybe a little bit different that you maybe normally don't do during communion time. And one thing is to celebrate that we are able to worship in community. Right, and as we come, I'm going to give you a little bit of time to pray. But maybe pray for two things. Right, I think first, maybe thank God for our community, and pray that we would be a community here at church, right, that would provide many people with a safe space to learn and grow in their faith. Right? I think we have a lot of work to do in that matter as well. But pray that, that thank God for this community, right, but also pray that we would be a community that would be able to have a space where people can learn and grow. And then secondly, I think pray for Chinatown and pray for the world, that God would be able to penetrate hearts, right, so that many would come to worship him. Right, so a little bit different for communion, but I think this is also an appropriate way of reflecting on communion, right, that because of the body of Christ that died for us, the blood of Christ has been shed for us, that we have been given this new family, this new community, right? And it's with this community that we go out to love the world and make disciples of all nations. All right, so let me give you a little bit of time just to come before the Lord. Harry and I will be standing on either side when you're ready. If you're a baptized believer, I want to invite you to come up and receive the elements, and then we will partake together. But why don't you spend some time in the Lord